Hey, what's going on, guys? I'm Gaming here, back with another video. Today's episode, we're taking a look at TBC and what class you should play in its upcoming release. Burning Crusade Classic Anniversary will launch tomorrow, February 5th at 3 p.m. PST. Now, this is going to be a very subjective video. Obviously, you should play whatever you want. Typically, whatever's most fun, but some people might be torn between two different classes or specs, etc. And they might want a little bit deeper understanding of how that class compares to another class in a specific element. So this video is going to be structured around three main questions: the fun factor, how good they are in PvP, and how good they are in PvE. And this is just going to be a quick general overview. We're not going to go into heavy detail here, but just, like a couple minutes per spec sort of deal. So we have PvE performance. So how well your class will contribute to raids or dungeons. We have PvP viability, so that's going to include like survivability, crowd control, and their burst damage potential. And then we also have the fun, and this is the most subjective part of the video. I don't know exactly what's fun to you, but what we tried to do for the rankings in this video is, most people consider themselves a caster or a melee player. So to a melee player, this might be a 3 or 4 star in fun. To a caster player, this might be a 3 or 4 star in fun. Just because it's 4 star on or 5 star on this list does not mean it's 4 or 5 star for you. So you have to first identify what type of class you like to play in WoW. So let's first start off with the Warlock here. So Warlock is a monster in TBC. They are super S tier in both rating as well as PvP. You can see they're both 5 star, and their fun factor is a 4. It's fringe 3, 4, and a big reason for that is because you will be playing Shadowbolt spec in TBC, and that is quite literally you just spamming Shadowbolt. So you'll be able to dip into Demonology for Demonic Sacrifice, and you're going to get a flat 15% shadow damage bonus. And this is going to stack really well with the Shadow Priest Shadow Weaving for a total of 30% bonus damage. You can also get multiple Warlocks to apply the improved Shadowbolt debuff, so you can actually get like 50% increased Shadowbolt damage from all your talents and everybody just kind of buffing you and amping your damage. Now in PvP, you'll be playing the Soul Link Siphon Life build, which is basically going to turn you into essentially a raid boss. You're very tanky, you hit very hard, and you bring a lot of utility. So S tier in both PvE and PvP, and then comes the fun factor. This just depends what spec that you play, right? If you are playing the Shadowbolt spec and you're just spamming Shadowbolts, it might not be quite as fun. Again, it could be 2 or 3 star in the fun factor. But if you are playing something like Affliction in PvP, then it could be more like a 4 to 5 star, just depending, again, if you're a caster player, if you're a melee player. Up next, we have the Hunter. So Hunter is another top tier raid DPS. They're up there with Warlock, but they're definitely middle of the pack in PvP. And where Hunter is going to be really strong is in some of the earlier raids. So Hunters can stack the tier 3 dungeon set, which actually gives them a huge buff to armor reduction. And it's really strong, and this will last you for a very long time before you have to replace it. And you will mostly top meters in early raids in TBC if you're playing Hunter. So due to this, you are not as gear dependent as other specs in this game for strong early DPS. And you'll mostly be playing a Beast Mastery. In PvP, Hunters will struggle a bit. You do have access to your Viper Sting, right, which can really drain mana from the enemy healer. But really, outside of that, your mobility is not very good. Your defenses are not very good. And you are also still going to suffer from the fact that you're probably going to get trained in PvP. And when you're slowed, rooted, snared, etc., Hunters really struggle to pump out any sort of damage. Now, in terms of the fun factor, I personally think Hunters are really fun. One thing that could bring this down to 4 star is TBC Hunters are infamous for their one macro button, or their one button macro. And essentially what this is going to do is you're going to press this macro and it's going to do your entire DPS rotation. And that is, a lot of people argue that's not very fun. And I agree with that. And in that case, if you don't find something like that fun, this could easily go down to a 2 or 3 star. But I truly think that Hunter is one of the most fun world PvP specs, world PvE specs. And I think that they do a great job at bridging the gap between a melee player and a caster. If you're kind of torn between melee and caster, I feel like Hunter will be a great alternative for you to pick up to kind of bridge that gap. So up next, we have a Warrior. So Warrior is not as strong in TBC as they are in Classic, but they're not bad. And it depends on what you're trying to do here. So if you are trying to tank, then this PvE rating goes up to 5 stars. They're the best tanks in TBC. You have your shield wall, last stand, you have your shield block, you have pretty much unmatched survivability from all the other tanks. Where they do kind of struggle in PvE is AoE dungeon tanking, compared to something like a Paladin. You do have a harder time holding threat, which is going to make those fast heroic pulls a little bit more stressful. In terms of PvE DPS, you can run arms if you want to act more like a support DPS, and if you want a little bit more personal DPS, you run something like Fury. So arms is going to bring the Blood Frenzy debuff, which can give you a little bit increased physical damage taken by the boss. You're going to get like improved shouts, things like that. So there's typically always one spot for an arms warrior in the raid. In PvP, you can run arms warrior, and it's actually really strong. And you can actually craft a mace called Storm Herald, which will stun the target for 4 seconds. No diminishing returns on that. So it's essentially just like a chance on hit once you equip it. So you can play warrior, since that doesn't have a DR, you can play warrior with a lot of different comps. That opens up the door to a lot of different comps. Now, in terms of the fun factor, definitely 4 or 5 star here. Your stance dancing, you're managing your rage, you're timing your cooldowns, but they are quite punishing if played incorrectly. So for Rogue in raids, their damage is a little bit lower compared to most other DPS, which means most guilds will only bring 1. Most of their value is going to come from exposed armor, their interrupts, and just kind of their general utility, not necessarily their raw damage numbers. And I would recommend Rogue if you're more of a solo player. If you like world PvP, if you like PvP, if you like skipping content, you can do like dungeon skips, for example. You have your lock picking. You can do like solo chest farming. And Rogue actually has a pretty good gold making potential due to all this. So I'd recommend Rogue if you do lean a little bit more towards the PvP side of things. But obviously they can be fun in PvE as well. And next we have Paladin. So TBC is the expansion where every Paladin spec finally works. So Protection Paladins are arguably the best dungeon tanks in the game. The AoE threat is pretty much unmatched. Holy Shield for them prevents crushing blows, which is an issue in Classic. And they're also really good against undead and demon mobs. For Retribution, you're not going to top meters or anything, but they do bring a lot of value through judgments, their mana regeneration, a decent off healing, really good utility cooldowns. Like they have their Bop, their Hand of Sacrifice. Actually, I believe it's Blessing of Sacrifice in TBC. I can't remember exactly. Their Lay on Hands, etc., etc. And a good Rep Paladin just kind of makes everyone around them better. For Holy Paladins, they're going to be very efficient in single target healing, so they're normally going to be your tank healer. They have really good defensive cooldowns as well. In PvP, Holy Paladin will struggle compared to a lot of the other healers as well. Same thing with like Retribution Paladin. And the main thing that hurts them in PvP is just their limited mobility. It's not necessarily a throughput issue. It's just they have issues escaping and sticking to a target. And in their fun factor, I personally think Paladin is 4 or 5 stars as well. I think just about everything in this guide is going to be at least 4 stars. Like Paladin is awesome because you can, what I used to do in TBC, this is what I mained in TBC, was a Protection Paladin. I would just go and gold farm with Paladin. I would go in front of the Black Temple raid, those mobs, those blood elves around there, and I would just farm the, I think it was Netherweave cloth stacks. And where I find a lot of fun in Paladin is just tagging, tons and tons of mobs and being able to tank them. So in my opinion, this is the best gold farming class in TBC, maybe behind Mage. And I think that they're ahead of Rogue for sure. Okay, and next we have our Mage. So one of the most consistently strong classes in TBC. In Raids, you're going to deal slightly less damage than Warlocks, but you will make up for that with really, really good utility. And really all 3 specs are viable depending on your gear and your raid comp. So typically for PvE, Frost is going to be the king of just 5-man content and heroics in general. Having that slow utility is really going to help out your tank and just kind of help the general survivability of your group. In dungeons, tanks get blasted from just how hard the mobs hit in heroic dungeons. So you'll be very, very useful to your group by going Frost. Then once you get into raids, you're going to be going either Fire or Arcane. Both are viable. I would recommend to go Fire in raids. Arcane is good, but you do need a support to be viable in raids. You do need some innervates on you from the Druid to be able to sustain the mana that you're going to be burning through on Arcane. But technically, Arcane can do just as much damage as Fire or better if you do have that support. But I would highly recommend Fire for Rage. You'll scale very well with Crit. In PvP, Frost Mage is going to be the most dominant spec. You just have so much control playing Frost Mage. You get the slows, the roots, the novas, the counter spells. You also have the burst damage to back all that up. But it is very, very skill dependent, so be aware of that, as mages have probably one of the highest skill ceilings in TBC. So the rotations are simple, but their cooldown management, their positioning, their movement, their spacing, etc., is really what's going to separate you from the pack. And in terms of fun, gotta be 5-star. Uh, they're like the casters of prop paladin world farming, in my opinion. They're better just because you do more damage, you can kill things faster. And I think they're really fun because all 5 specs are viable. You can't say that for most specs in TBC. Or I say viable. All 3 specs are really good. Most specs in TBC are viable, but not all their specs are like near top tier in something, right? So you have top tier fire and arcane damage in raids, top tier world farming, top tier in heroic dungeons, top tier. Did I say PvP already? Top tier in PvP. No matter what you choose to do, Mage is going to fit the bill in pretty much every scenario. Okay, up next we have our Shaman. So Shaman's definitely going to be 5 stars in PvE due to their totem mechanics and just what they bring to the raid. Just by existing, Shaman, just because like you're in the raid, you're going to be immensely beneficial as long as you're pressing your totem buttons. And every single spec in PvE brings something very strong to the table. So enhancement, you're going to be boosting your group with Unleash Rage and your Wind Fury. Elemental does perform pretty well early, but it does fall off later. They just don't have the scaling baked into them that a lot of the other specs have. Scaling really favors other casters than Elemental, but Elemental has a ton of burst damage. And then Restoration Shaman is going to be the best AoE healer in the game. And they're also really good for tank healing as well. But typically you're going to be looking at chain heal spam with Shaman. So Shaman's going to be bringing their totems, going to be bringing their bloodlust. In TBC, totems are still group specific. They're still party only, so you will need multiple shamans to cover all those groups. So just literally being a shaman most of the times is going to get you invited to a raid, even if you are something like elemental. And one of the things that are really cool about shamans, in my opinion, is they're the burst kings of the expansion. You got your Wind Fury crits happening with enhancement. You have your you can overload with elemental, do insane crits, and that's kind of what drives the fun factor for me in Shaman. Their bottom line for PvP essentially is if you're allowed to stand there and cast or just do your damage, you're going to be very impactful in PvP. You do a ton of damage. But they kind of fall into the same bucket as hunters. If you're trained, you're kind of squishy. You kind of struggle to just survive essentially in a PvP scenario. You have the burst damage, you have the kill pressure, but you're just going to get trained most of the time. So if you're allowed to actually play the game, you're going to dominate. If you're getting focused, it's manageable, but it is going to be way more difficult than playing something like a mage, for example. Really good utility out of Shaman, right? You do have Tremor, you got like grounding totem, etc. So I'd put Shaman as like the utility kings of the expansion, along with really good burst damage. Up next we have Priest. So for Shadow Priest is like super essential to have in every raid. Every raid group is going to have at least one Shadow Priest because you're kind of like the mana battery. And you also bring Shadow Weaving to the group, which is going to be a massive DPS amp for your party. So you'll typically be going in with the casters group, with your Warlock and your Mages, unless your healers might be struggling with mana. Then they could put you in the healer group, but most of the time you're going to be in the group with other spellcasters doing damage. Now, your personal DPS is actually pretty decent in the early tiers, but they do not have the scaling that a lot of these other specs have. Kind of fall in a similar bucket as like Elemental Shaman. But, the raid value of a Shadow Priest is probably... Not many people play Shadow Priest, and you got to have a couple of them, at least one. So if you really want to play a DPS spec, and you really want to like make sure that you have a spot secured in raid, Shadow Priest is probably going to be the move, or something like Shaman. We also have Holy Priest, so extremely flexible healer, really good raid coverage, pretty good strong single target healing as well. Holy Priest scales great through the entire expansion. And often they're underrated, but they're very reliable healers this expansion. And they're typically the go-to over Disc. So for Disc, you will have PI, and it is strong, but it's mostly just brought for like specific strategies. And where Disc will shine actually is in TBC. And Disc is probably the best raid healer, the best arena healer in TBC. You have your pain suppression, you have your shield, you have your mana efficiency, you just have insane durability. and then put PI on top of that, you just have really good kill windows. So you're going to dominate, the 2v2 and 3v3 ladder. And then finally, we have the Druid. So the ultimate flex pick's really the jack of all trades. So in PvP, if you do want to go feral tank, you're going to have a really big health pool. You get pretty good threat generation. The problem with feral Druid tanking is you do have weak cooldowns. So a lot of the times they will actually be put in the off tank role due to that. But overall, a pretty decent tank. Definitely better than they were in Classic, but I would say that they are, of the 3 tanks, probably the worst. In terms of PvE DPS, you do have 2 options. You've got the Cat Feral DPS or the Moonkin. If you like complexity in your rotation and you like doing things, or you like pressing the same few buttons over and over, you can go Feral DPS because there is power shifting in TBC, which will add a form of skill depth. If you don't know what power shifting is, essentially it's just where you shift into a form. Instead of waiting on like your energy bar to regenerate, you can shift into a form and it will snap your energy to a certain level. So go to 0 energy, shift out and then back into cat form, and then you'll reset your energy to 40, 50, 60, whatever it is in TBC. I believe that Feral DPS has the better DPS out of the 2. Definitely not a top DPS contender, but a decent DPS. You will bring something called Leader of the Pack as a Feral Druid. So this is basically going to increase ranged and melee critical chance of all party members by 5%. And a Moonkin will bring the opposite of that. You'll bring Spell, Crit, and Hit, which is going to be really good for caster groups. So they're both useful to a raid. For Moonkin, your DPS is just okay. You do have a little bit of off healing as well. But typically, honestly, both of these specs are normally just taken for their buffs rather than their numbers. And Resto Druid is going to be really good in terms of healing. So Resto Druid gets the addition of Tree of Life and Life Bloom in TBC. They're typically better tank healers than raid healers. They do bring good utility, right? They bring their Rebirth, their Fairy Fire, Innervate, your Gift of the Wild. And of course, if you do spec into Tree of Life, you do get that party-wide buff that increases all healing received by 25% of the Druid's total spirit. Unfortunately, it is just, from a throughput standpoint, it's just outmatched by literally all the other healers in TBC, but does not mean it's bad. It is completely viable. It's still good. I'd probably put it at like a B rating, whereas the other healers are A's and S. Fun factor here could be somewhere between 4 and 5. You're really going to like Druid if you like playing all the different specs in the game. If you like to play caster, sometimes you want to play melee, sometimes you want to tank, sometimes you want to heal. That's where Druid really shines. Especially if you're like an altaholic who just likes to, play all the different roles. You'll be able to do pretty much everything that you want to do in this game on Druid. They really do not have any sort of limitations. Now, in terms of PvP, going back into Resto, Resto Druid is actually probably the best healer. I think they're tied up there with Disc Priest. I think I said earlier that Disc Priest was the best healer. They're up there with Disc Priest, mainly due to their insane mobility. And they're really hard to... Their mobility plus their hots just make you really hard to lock down, essentially. And you just have an absurd toolkit. You get your Cyclone, you get Travel Form, you get Roots, you get Stealth, and you just have an answer to pretty much everything. Feral's going to be pretty strong in 2v2. You do have really good pressure and control. You have that Druid control, right? But the burst damage of the Feral Druid. And they do somewhat decently when trained. The problem is when you do get trained, you do have to shift into bear form to stay alive, and that's really going to hurt your damage. And then Moonkin as well. They're kind of rare. You do have some burst damage and some off healing potential as Moonkin, but again, just extremely vulnerable when focused. All right, guys, that's the end of this video. If you guys enjoyed it, please consider liking and subscribing to the channel. See you guys in the next one. Peace.